Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
"235 years ago, in a hot summer in Philadelphia, two brilliant men argued over a simple phrase: and provide for the general welfare of the United States." James Madison said those words were a boundary, a fence, a limit on federal power. Congress could tax and spend only to execute its enumerated powers. Otherwise, why list any powers at all? Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, said those words were an engine, a grant of broad national authority to promote prosperity and security. Congress could spend for any purpose benefiting the nation as a whole. Those two never resolved their disagreement. The Constitution was ratified with the ambiguity intact, and for the next 150 years, America lived mostly under Madison's interpretation. Federal spending stayed low, states dominated policy, and enumerated powers meant something. But then came crisis, depression, war, social transformation. And in 1937, the Supreme Court sided definitively with Hamilton. The conception of the spending power advocated by Hamilton has prevailed over that of Madison. That was the word of Justice Cardozo during Helvering v. Davis. With that sentence, the constitutional framework that had governed America since 1789 ended, and something new began. This series has traced that transformation from Madison's enumerated republic to Hamilton's administrative state, from restraint to capacity, from structure to procedure, from limited government to what we have today. Today's episode, we complete that journey. We synthesize what we've learned, we assess where we stand, and we ask, what comes next? I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast and our series, From General Welfare to the Great Society. Today's our final episode. It's an epilogue. From General Welfare to the Great Society, the Arc of Administrative Power. Some of you may be tuning in to this episode for the first time, and that's fine. This episode will provide a summary of the entire timeline, the entire arc. I encourage you to go back to the original episodes for more detail if you'd like a broader understanding of the individual events that shaped our history and brought us to this point in our administrative cycle. So let's walk through the entire arc. We've traced this for the past 235 years because understanding how we got here is essential to understanding where we are and where we can go. The founding debate itself between 1787 and 1789, between James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, laid the entire groundwork of this series. James Madison said, general welfare is bounded by enumeration. The federal government has specific, limited powers. Everything else, that's reserved to the states and the people. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, he saw general welfare as an independent fiscal authority. The federal government can tax and spend for any national purpose as long as it was for a national purpose. The Constitution became deliberately vague because ratification, the acquiescence of all of the different parties involved, the different states involved, required this ambiguity to pass. The debate itself became postponed, not resolved. Between 1789 and 1860, from the signing of the Constitution to the Civil War, you had enumerated powers that were in practice. Now, there was this continued friction. The Marshall Court, for example, between 1819 and 1824, McCulloch established implied powers. Gibbons broadened the Commerce Clause, and this opened the doors constitutionally for Hamilton's vision. But politics themselves kept them mostly closed. Jefferson slashed spending, Madison vetoed infrastructure, and Jackson killed the bank. Federal spending was around 2% of GDP in peacetime. For context, just so you're aware, again, we're at 25% of GDP today. States dominated education, welfare, infrastructure, and police power. This was Madison's republic in practice. It was limited, restrained, and mostly working. But slavery's shadow, the federal restraint preserved sectional peace at the cost of justice. And that contradiction would destroy the system. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, shattered the old order. 4 years, 600,000 dead. And federal power exploded. Conscription, the income tax, a national currency, debt 10 times larger, and bureaucracy transformed. The Union preserved, slavery was destroyed, but the constitutional structure also shattered. So from 1865 to 1877, we talked about Reconstruction, and that was a second founding. You had the 13th Amendment, in which slavery was abolished by federal command. You had the 14th Amendment with birthright citizenship. Federal government was now the guarantor of individual rights against the states, due process, and equal protection. And then you had the 15th Amendment, voting rights protected from racial discrimination. This was a constitutional revolution. Federal-state relationship fundamentally was altered. No longer dual federalism. Federal government now was supreme when rights were at stake. But back to the courts, the Slaughterhouse cases of 1873, that gutted the Privileges and Immunities Clause. The court betrayed Reconstruction's promise. And the Jim Crow era, 1877 to 1954, you had Plessy, which upheld segregation. The court tolerated apartheid while protecting economic liberty of contract. The constitutional failure, limited government couldn't protect the liberty that mattered most, freedom from state-sanctioned racial subjugation. From 1877 to 1929, you had industrialization and the Lochner era. The economy was transformed. Railroads, telegraphs, national markets, corporations larger than state governments. The federal response to this was the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1877, Sherman Antitrust in 1890, and the 16th Amendment enabling income tax in 1913, and the Federal Reserve also in 1913. The infrastructure of national economic management was built. But in the courts, in the Lochner Court, 1897 to 1937, it protected economic liberty through the Due Process Clause. Liberty of contract became constitutional doctrine, but it was applied inconsistently. You had economic rights, yes. Racial rights, racial equality, no. And then there was World War I. Our involvement, 1917 to 1918, that established emergency precedent. The federal government coordinated the entire economy. And it showed what's possible when government claims necessity. From 1929 to 1933, you had the start of the Great Depression. It was an economic catastrophe. 25% unemployed, banks collapsed, industrial production crashed, and human suffering was immense. The political pressure for federal action became overwhelming. Madison's restraint seemed cruel, and constitutional limits seemed like obstacles. And everything we'd been building towards broke in 1937. From 1937 to 1942, you had the constitutional revolution. FDR's New Deal tested every boundary, and the court struck down programs Schnechter, Butler, Carter Cole. The court-packing threat of 1937 preceded Roberts switching, and the court reversed course. In Helvering v. Davis in 1937, it was quoted, "Hamilton has prevailed over Madison. Federal spending power was unlimited, and the courts deferred to Congress." In Stewart Machine, 1937, cooperative federalism through fiscal coercion was born. In West Coast Hotel, 1937, the liberty of contract, that died, and economic regulation became unlimited. And in Wickard v. Filburn in 1942, there was no activity too local for Federal Commerce Clause to reach. Think about this. In 5 years, every structural limit fell. Enumerated spending was gone. Dual federalism was replaced with cooperative coercion. Economic liberty ceased being a constitutional right, and territorial limits, they were erased by the aggregate effects doctrine. Judicial review became deference. The Constitution was not amended, but it meant something completely different. And then you had the Administrative Procedure Act. Revolution became routine and emergency became permanent. The APA in 1946 imposed procedural requirements on agencies. We talked about notice and comment, hearings, and judicial review. For a procedure without structure, agencies still combine legislative, executive, and judicial power all within one. The non-delegation doctrine dies, Congress delegates broadly, and the courts defer. You had Chevron all the way up until Loper Bright in 2024. The administrative state became the permanent machinery of governance. And then, from 1964 to 1968, the Great Society was launched. LBJ, he took the tools that FDR built and weaponized them for social transformation. Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, federal education funding, housing assistance, environmental regulation, arts endowments. 200 plus major laws in 4 years. The federal government assumes responsibility for healthcare, education, poverty relief, housing, areas previously state and local. Fiscal federalism was perfected. The states became entirely dependent on federal grants. In 1960, federal grants represented 11% of state revenues, and by 2020, it was 30%. Almost a third of all state revenues were coming from the federal government. And in 1971, Bretton Woods collapsed and the gold window closed, which created fiat currency in the United States. And fiat currency enabled unlimited spending without the external discipline tied to a fixed asset. The Great Society and fiat money became twins, each enabling the other. And in 1970 to 1976, we talked about welfare rights. Goldberg v. Kelly in 1970, welfare becomes constitutional property. Statutory benefits were protected by due process. Programs created by Congress became constitutional entitlements protected by the courts. Dependency itself was proceduralized, formalized, made permanent. And then came the conservative counter-revolution. It was an intellectual revival with names like Friedman, Hayek, Buchanan, Rothbard, who would all build case for limits, for restraint. Reagan was elected in 1980 on a landslide, promising to shrink government. And there were real achievements. There were tax cuts, regulatory review, deregulation was continued, and market confidence was restored. But there was structural failure. Spending continued to grow. The agencies remained, and entitlements, they were seen as untouchable. And the debt tripled. Why? Path dependency, public choice dynamics, concentrated benefits, dispersed cost. Programs, they created constituencies that were impossible to overcome. From Madison's enumerated republic to the administrative welfare state in 235 years, each step, each legislative decision, each executive order, each constitutional case in the courts seemed reasonable at the time. Each crisis justified expansion, and each program addressed real suffering. But the cumulative effect, the consequence to those actions, limited government was replaced by unlimited government constrained only by politics and procedure. So where does this leave us? Let's look at the present landscape honestly. Federal spending, approximately 25% of GDP. We compare that to 2% before the Civil War, 3% in the 1920s, and only 18% in 1960. Entitlements are now 60% of the budget. Defense is 15%. Everything else, 25%. And the interest on the debt, growing rapidly. It's hard to even comprehend the amount of spending we do in a single year, let alone our debt. Our spending is between $6.5 and $7 trillion. Our inflows, the amount that we're taking from taxpayers and other sources, is around $4.5 to $5 trillion, leaving us a $2 trillion deficit, adding on to a $38 or $39 trillion debt. Trillion is a number that is almost impossible to understand, impossible to comprehend. We talked about the equation of seconds in time to trillion, million, and billion, the difference between them. Where 1 million is approximately 11 and a half days, 1 billion is 30,000. It's even too incomparable for me to even remember. I have to look at my notes to see exactly this number. There are 86,000 seconds in a day, 31 million seconds in a year. Thus, a million seconds ago was 11 and a half days ago. Just 11 and a half days ago. A billion seconds ago was 31.7 years ago. So think about that. The difference between $1 million in debt, about 11 days. We all can conceptualize what we were doing in 11 and a half days ago. But $1 billion in debt, that equals 31. That's the early 90s. That's the early 90s. The difference between a million and a billion. And then think about this. The difference between 1 billion and 1 trillion. If you think a difference between a million and a billion is hard to kind of wrap your head around, the difference between a billion and a trillion seconds ago was 30,000 BC. A billion was the 90s. Most of us were alive then. A trillion was 30,000 BC. And yet we're adding $2 trillion every year in federal spending debt. And 39 trillion seconds ago, 39, which is what our debt is today, that was 1.2 million years ago. And then when you think about our unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, what is actually owed with these entitlements in which the courts have proceduralized, you cannot take these rights away now, according to the courts. That's over $100 trillion. The numbers are just mind-blowing. They are impossible to comprehend. And because of that ignorance we have for understanding that math, we continue to perpetuate it. And let's look at the federal and state relations. Federal grants 30 to 35% of state revenues. The federal government controls the state purse strings. This is that fiscal coercion we talked about. The states administratively implement federal programs with federal rules, but it's cooperative federalism, meaning it's fiscal dependency. Now, the block grants that we mentioned in the last episode, that reduced some of the micromanagement, but it maintained that federal control. And the regulatory state itself. The Code of Regulation is over 185,000 pages. The Federal Register is 80,000 to 90,000 pages of new regulations annually. And hundreds of agencies combining legislative, executive, and judicial functions. There's more rules made by agencies than laws passed by Congress. So the fiscal reality, the national debt is $38 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio is 120%, which is higher than even at the peak of World War II. And unfunded obligations, Social Security, Medicare, 100 to even $200 trillion present value, depending on those assumptions. And there's no political constituency for fiscal discipline. It doesn't exist in the two major parties. We see that by their actions. We see politicians, and there are a few, that stand up for balanced budgets or will balk at continuing resolutions and want to set actual restraints on congressional power or executive authority. And they are laughed at, demeaned, or set aside by their own party, let alone their political opposition. So what's this mean? The Constitution's text still says Congress has enumerated powers. The 10th Amendment still says powers not delegated are reserved to the states. But in practice, Congress can spend for anything it deems beneficial. Elvering. Congress can regulate any activity affecting interstate commerce. Wickard. States implement federal policy or lose funding. Cooperative federalism. And the courts defer to agencies on statutory interpretation, though the recent ruling on Loper-Bright may change this and alter this. We'll see over time. But benefits become entitlements once created. Goldberg. This is not the government our founders designed. It's not even the government FDR built. It's evolved beyond both. A permanent administrative apparatus managing most aspects of life, funded by fiat currency, constrained by procedures, not by principles. Maybe the arc isn't complete, though. Recent Supreme Court decisions suggest renewed skepticism. NFIB versus Sabellis in 2012, it was the first enforcement of the anti-coercion doctrine. The ACA's Medicaid expansion, the gun to the head, was limited by a 7-2 vote, which included liberals on the court. That was meaningful, but again, limited. It didn't question cooperative federalism generally, just this particular individual coercive instance. Then you had West Virginia versus the EPA in 2012, and this was the major questions doctrine. Transformative policies of vast significance require clear congressional authorization. You can't hide elephants in mouse holes. It limits agencies on big questions, though it doesn't touch ordinary regulation. In Loper Wright versus Raimondo in 2024, that did overturn Chevron. The Chevron deference we talked about from the 1980s was overturned, and courts must now interpret statutes independently and not defer to agencies. To what level? To what clearing of micromanagement? Time will tell. It's potentially significant, but too early to know the political impact, because most statutes still delegate broad discretion, and we know that the agencies themselves will adapt to the change in the legal status. Now, there are some hints. Some justices, Gorsuch and Thomas, question unlimited delegation. But no statute has been invalidated yet, and the doctrine remains dormant since 1935. These decisions might represent a genuine constitutional revival, or they might just be marginal adjustments to an entrenched system. It'll take decades to know for sure. The administrative state has enormous momentum. Doctrine changes matter, but institutional inertia, perhaps that matters more. The machinery built since 1937 won't be dismantled by a few court cases. Too many people depend on it. Too many interests defend it, and too many politicians benefit from it. So, from a libertarian perspective, let me articulate clearly what was lost in this transformation. One, the enumeration principle. The original federal government has only listed powers. The default is government may not. Now, the federal government has plenary powers, limited only by individual rights. The default is government may, unless. What died? Any meaningful distinction between federal and general government power. The 10th Amendment, it's become a dead letter. 2, the separation of powers. The original, the legislative makes the law, the executive enforces, and the judicial interprets. There was no branch that can bind these powers. Now, agencies within the administrative state, agencies do all three. They write regulation, this is the legislative. They enforce the rules, this is the executive, and they adjudicate violations, this is the judicial, all within the agency's purview. What died? Madison's ambition counteracting ambition. The checks and balances have been replaced by administrative discretion. 3, federalism. Originally, states were independent sovereigns, laboratories of democracy, competing for citizens. Now, states act as administrative arms, implementing federal policy. They're fiscally dependent, and they're uniform rather than diverse. What died? Cooperative federalism, state experimentation, local variation, and citizens voting with their feet and moving to another state. And then 4, individual sovereignty. Originally, citizens were independent, economically autonomous, and the government was subservient. Now, the citizens depend on government benefits, licenses, and permissions for economic survival. What died? The economic independence as a precondition for political independence. Self-reliance has been replaced by entitlement. And 5, fiscal discipline. Originally, we had the gold standard. We had balanced budgets, mostly. We had limited taxation. We had external constraint on spending. Now we have fiat currency. We have structural deficits. We have a national debt exceeding GDP and no external constraint. What died? Market discipline on fiscal policy. Future generations obligated without any consent. Of course, it's hard to argue taxation without representation when you're not even alive yet. And then 6, negative liberty. Originally, freedom from interference. Rights as immunities from power. Government secures pre-existing rights. Now, freedom through provision. Rights as claims upon others. And government creates and grants rights. Of course, this means what died was liberty as autonomy, replaced by liberty as dependency. I want to state that last one again. Negative liberty, the freedom from interference from government, the freedom for autonomy, versus the idea of positive liberty, which is that certain things are guaranteed towards you to be successful. But that creates rights upon others to provide that service for you. Healthcare is a big one, and we hear that today. Everyone has a right to free healthcare. Free healthcare. If you were to make healthcare truly free, you're conscripting the labor of the healthcare providers, the physicians, the nurses, the hospital staff, etc. And if you say, no, the government will pay them, it wouldn't be slavery. We wouldn't be conscripting their labor. We would compensate them for providing that service. Fine. But that compensation, that comes from another form of conscription. That comes from taking the property of others through taxation. And when you're taking the property of others to pay somebody to serve somebody else, this is all removing the individual autonomy and creating a condition of subservience to the government. And it's, again, a change from the concept of negative liberty to that of positive liberty. The Constitution was designed to limit power in order to preserve freedom. The transformation since 1937 inverted that. It concentrated power in the name of expanding freedom. Libertarians, though, argue power concentrated cannot be constrained through procedure alone. You cannot have unlimited government that remains limited through process. Rothbard once said, once government becomes the universal provider, all human relationships are warped into political relationships. Hayek said, we shall never prevent the abuse of power if we are not prepared to limit power in the first place. Was this transformation inevitable? Was Madison's framework simply incompatible with modernity? Or was it a choice made incrementally, crises by crises, but a choice nonetheless, to prioritize capacity over restraint, results over structure, provision over independence? Now, it's no secret, I am a libertarian and I hold libertarian views. But in this history that we've looked at, I presented the argument for why these decisions were made by the people at the time, and they're continued to be supported by certain people and policies here today. So with that in mind, I want to steelman the other side of the argument. I want to steelman the progressive view. And so I'm going to talk about that view and their justification, the rationalization, the purpose for why that is a valid argument. Because intellectual honesty requires presenting the strongest version of any opposing view. So let's make the case for progressives and why the transformation was necessary and constitutional. 1, the Constitution should be a living document. The founders couldn't foresee industrial capitalism, global markets, climate change, pandemics, nuclear weapons, or the internet. The constitutional meaning must adapt or the document becomes irrelevant. The original understanding is important, but not determinative. The 14th Amendment did transform the Constitution from a compact among states to a charter of national citizenship. And that requires federal capacity, not just federal restraint. 2, modern problems require national solutions. Individual states cannot address interstate pollution and environmental degradation. Individual states cannot address financial contagion and systemic risk. And individual states cannot address labor exploitation across state lines, nor monopoly power and federal and market failures, pandemic disease, or climate change. Madison's federalism was designed for an agrarian republic of 4 million. It cannot handle an integrated economy of 335 million. National markets require national regulation. Interstate problems need federal coordination. 3, administrative expertise is essential. Complex technical problems, securities regulation, drug approval, telecommunication standards, environmental science, these require specialized knowledge. And elected generalists cannot micromanage. So, delegation to experts with accountability, the APA procedures and judicial review, is a practical necessity. It's not tyranny, it's adaptation to complexity. 4, the New Deal Great Society achieved real goods. Elderly poverty went from 35% to 10%. Therefore, Social Security and Medicare work. Child labor was eliminated. We have a 40-hour work week and workplace safety was improved. The financial system was stabilized, mostly. Bank failures have been rare since the advent of the FDIC. Civil rights acts were enforced where states wouldn't. Federal power was necessary to end apartheid. And environmental protection, clean air and water, and species preservation. These achievements all required federal capacity. States alone could not and would not deliver them. And then 5, liberty requires capacity, not just interference. What good is freedom if you're starving, illiterate, without health care, discriminated against, exploited by monopoly, or trapped by market failure? Positive liberty isn't an abandonment of freedom, it's the condition for freedom's exercise. I'm going to pause there for my steel manning for a minute and again reflect on that difference between negative liberty and positive liberty. Negative liberty, as a libertarian, we view that as the capability for individual autonomy, freedom from interference. The progressive argument for positive liberty is that certain conditions must be met first for you to be able to exercise freedom. You can't be free if you are starving, if you are injured, if you are infirmed. You can't be free if you are illiterate, discriminated against, or exploited. That's the argument. The argument is, should government be setting these preconditions for everybody to live under? Or should government be refraining from interfering at all? Negative liberty versus positive liberty. I'm going to continue on with the progressive argument. And they would say FDR's second Bill of Rights, the economic security enables political liberty. Without baseline security, liberty becomes the privilege of the wealthy. And the sixth point that I would say for them is private power threatens liberty. Libertarians focus on government coercion, but private power can be equally tyrannical. Company towns, monopolies, employer exploitation, racial discrimination by private actors. Where government regulations can enhance liberty by checking private domination. Not all coercion is governmental. Okay. Now the challenge to that, the progressive challenge. Libertarians typically want to restore pre-1937 constitutional limits. But what's the alternative? Return to 1920s laissez-faire? That led to the Great Depression. Leave everything to the states? That led to Jim Crow. Pure markets? That created child labor, unsafe workplaces, economic collapse. Minimal government? Who protects the vulnerable, ensures equality, addresses collective action problems, and manages systemic risk? The welfare state with democratic accountability, procedural safeguards, and judicial review isn't perfect, but it's better than the alternatives, they say. Liberty and security, individual rights, and social provision can coexist, they say. Okay. So, where does that leave us? Let's think about that. This is what we would say constitutional tension in today's modern age. Admittedly, like all of us, I think we continue to evolve and grow in our interpretations of what is the best policy for ourselves, our families, our neighbors. And so what I will tell you is what I believe at this point as a libertarian, after tracing this entire arc. Both Madison and Hamilton were right about something important, and both were wrong about something crucial. Madison was right. Power without limits becomes tyranny. Structural protections matter more than procedural ones. And each expansion creates constituencies that prevent contraction. Also was right that emergency powers become permanent authorities, that fiscal discipline requires external constraints, and that economic independence is a prerequisite for political liberty. But where Madison was wrong, his framework, it could not protect rights when states violated them. Slavery, Jim Crow. Modern integrated economy needs coordination that the idea of his federalism couldn't necessarily provide. And there are some problems that are generally national and require a federal response beyond just defense. So pure restraint can be, let's just say, complex. Hamilton, he was right too about certain things. National problems require national capacity. Governments must be able to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. And economic development benefits from coordinated policy. Security and liberty can be compatible, and flexible power enables effective response to crisis. But where he was wrong, unlimited power, even democratically accountable, tends towards abuse. Temporary emergency measures become permanent expansions. Fiscal flexibility without discipline leads to unsustainable debt. Administrative state will grow beyond democratic control, and provision creates dependency as much as security. Maybe we need both restraint and capacity, structure and flexibility, limits and adaptation. The question really is, yes, the progressives are right that there can be private coercion. There can be private company faults. When we talk about company towns, when we talk about abuses, sure, that absolutely can happen. But when the federal government is creating those abuses, there is no entity stronger. There is no entity bigger. There is no entity more capable of inflicting greater tyranny than the federal government. And I think that's the point that has to be thought of, that has to be understood. When we look at the ratchet effect that we've seen where power increases and never recedes truly. Whether it's from World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Great Society, it's a ratchet effect that goes up and never recedes back to the baseline. So even if you are in agreement, if you are a progressive in an agreement that there needs to be some cap on the expansion of government, else government becomes the ultimate tyrannical force. There has to be some limit. How do you set that limit? And if we exceed that limit, you know that there's no rescission back, right? There's no coming back. So how do you control for that? That's the question the founders did not answer, the 1937 didn't answer, and that we still haven't answered. Perhaps constitutional government is perpetually unsettled. It's not a problem to solve, but a tension to manage. Neither pure Madisonian restraint nor pure Hamiltonian energy is sustainable. The sweet spot, if it exists, lies somewhere in between, and it shifts with circumstances. The challenge, finding limits that constrain without paralyzing. Flexibility that adapts without metastasizing. We have not found that balance, and maybe we never will. This series traced how Madison's republic became Hamilton's administrative state, how general welfare went from restraint to a blank check, how emergency became permanent, and how programs became rights. The arc is complete from 1787 to today, from 5 words to trillion-dollar budgets, from enumerated powers to unlimited scope. But the story does not end here, because new challenges are emerging. The new Leviathan, we have the administrative state we've examined, built for welfare and regulation, is now being repurposed for surveillance and control. Post 9/11, we have a national security apparatus. We have Patriot Act authorities. We have digital surveillance. We have algorithmic governance. COVID showed how public health can justify extraordinary restrictions. Social media platforms, private entities wielding power to shape speech, politics, and information flow. Central bank digital currencies potentially giving government granular control over every transaction. The machinery built for welfare is now being used for something else. Crisis governance is the new normal. That will be the subject of another series. How emergency became the operating principle. How the administrative state, born for welfare, now governs through crises. But that's for another time. For now, we have questions that remain. Can limited government be restored, or is the administrative state permanent? Can fiscal discipline return, or will fiat currency enable unlimited promises until crises forces reset? Can federalism be revived, or are states forever subordinate to federal fiscal power? And can economic independence replace programmatic dependency? Or has that ship sailed? I don't know. Nobody really does. What I do know is that ideas matter. Understanding history matters. Knowing how we got here helps us think about where we're going. Madison and Hamilton gave us a framework for thinking about power, liberty, and government. Their debate did not end in 1789. It did not end in 1937. It continues in Congress, in elections, in conversations like this. My hope for this entire series is that you understand the constitutional transformation a bit better. That you see both what was gained and what was lost. That you think more deeply about the trade-offs we've made. Whether you're progressive or libertarian or somewhere in between, you should understand the other side's strongest arguments. You should wrestle with the genuine tensions. And you should recognize this was not inevitable. This was chosen. Maybe wisely, maybe not, but it was chosen. And which means different choices remain possible today. 235 years after Madison and Hamilton debated 5 words, the American experiment continues. Hamilton won the constitutional argument in 1937, but Madison's warning echoes. Liberty rarely dies from malice, it wanes under benevolence unbounded. Was Hamilton's victory America's triumph? Or did we trade structural liberty for programmatic security and discover the trade was not worth it? History hasn't decided. Neither should you, and neither should I, without careful thought. Thank you for joining me on this journey from general welfare to the Great Society, from enumerated powers to the administrative state, from Madison's restraint to Hamilton's capacity. This debate continues. The Constitution's meaning remains contested, and your voice, your understanding, your vote, your advocacy matters. Stay curious, stay free. Keep questioning authority, even when that authority claims to act for your benefit. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been From General Welfare to the Great Society on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have more questions, I encourage you to subscribe and join us on consequentialactions.com. Start a dialogue, or find me on X at @jkellick. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to all of these episodes. We really appreciate your support.